Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Life is a story we tell ourselves. I'm your host, Don Murphy. We have been on a brief hiatus, but we're back now, and for the next several weeks, we'll be talking about the funding crisis and other threats facing our National Park Service. According to the 2020 Best Places to Work in the Federal Government Survey, the Park Service ranked 353rd out of 411 agencies. And last year's survey dropped the agency to 371st out of 432 agencies when employees were asked if their agency was accomplishing its mission. Joining us to begin the discussion on how to save our national parks is Audrey Peterman. Mrs. Peterman is a trusted ally among employees of the National Park Service, which manages the National Park Services and is considered an impeccable source of information by many members of the public. She's co-founder of multiple grassroots organizations, including the South Florida Community Partners, Keeping It Wild Atlanta, and a founding board member of Greening Youth Foundation. She is the author of 3 books focused on the national parks and writes prolifically about them, including Mondays and Fridays in the Joy Train, her blog dedicated to promoting a pandemic of joy. I love that. This thought leader is highly informed, empathetic, and has demonstrated the best of the spirit of the national park system, for which the NPCA named her Centennial Leader in 2022, and NPCA is the National Parks Conservation Association. She received the National Wildlife Federation for People Award in 2023, recognizing her efforts to bridge the yawning chasm between the conservation and environmental justice communities. At this time of crisis, when NPS employees rate the agency 371st out of 432 in its ability to carry out its mission, we must accept that a transformation is needed. And there are few people better able to inspire this transformation than Audrey Peterman. So she's going to share with us on how we might go about fixing some of the seemingly intractable problems in the National Park Service. So welcome to the podcast, Audrey. It's great to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to you, Don, for the introduction and for the opportunity. I must say, first off, that I don't work for the Park Service and never have worked for the Park Service. I come to this out of a total love and delight in knowing the National Park System and the people of the National Park Service, and wanting to do everything that I can to help bring the status of the Park Service and the status of the morale of the people who work for the Park Service to into the public domain, because I know that so many millions of people love and treasure our national park system and would be, as I was, traumatized to learn that the people who are charged with protecting these, irreplaceable places feel this way about the agency where they work. So I identified that as quite a big problem. And I wanted to make certain the public knows about it so that we can all together come up with answers. Now, I can tell you that one of the first answers, and a very vital one that's at the root actually of the whole situation, is the lack of adequate funding for the Park Service. You know, the Park Service budget is rolled up into the budget for the Department of Interior, which includes several other land management agencies. But I know that on the table is a huge cut to the budget, which has never been sufficient to begin with. So if you don't have a sufficient budget, then you can't employ enough of the right people to take care of this vast treasury of our natural, cultural, and historic treasures. So that is item number one. I know that this week, the leadership Congress is going to be working on determining the budget and or determining whether they're going to pass a continuing resolution. But I think that at any time where there's an option, as many people as possible should know what is going on so that we can reach out to our representatives in Congress and to the leadership of Congress to make the statement we value our national parks and our national park system because the park system, the park service that was created as an agency in 1916 is intended to protect the national park system, which consists of more than 85 million acres of the most pristine lands in America, such as the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Yosemite, the Everglades, and also our most significant historic sites, which, protect the history and legacy and contributions of all Americans.
Well, that's
So
absolute.
wrapping up
I
in that
mean,
package, I think we have enough to lobby Congress to uh, make certain that there's a sufficient budget so that we can take care of these places into perpetuity.
well, absolutely. I know you were mentioning that you've never worked for the National Park Service. My listeners, some of them already know that I spent several years as Deputy Director of the National Park Service. I was also, I guess, previous to you for about 10 years on the board of the National Parks Conservation Association and also served as Director of California State Parks and have spent most of my career working on issues like this, which brings to mind my next question. So I joined, for example, the board of the National Parks Conservation Association in the early 1990s and was on the board for almost 10 years. And I know you've been on the board too. I mentioned the National Park Conservation Association because it's the main agency, the oldest agency that's been, or that is nonprofit, that's been working on protecting our national parks, lobbying for the funding and resources that are necessary. The Great Americans Outdoors Act was passed a couple of years ago, which provided for funding for the maintenance backlog and for other resources for national parks. Yet, and still, Congress does not appropriate the appropriate funds for taking care of our national parks. So the main question is, and I think we should have some discussion about this, is that this has been going on forever and nothing changes. I mean, this is a problem that, I'm 73 years old, been working in parks for 50 years, and we've been talking about the same old problem for my lifetime and for much of the time that you've been involved in parks. Why do you think this is such an intractable problem? I mean, we've been working on this for years. NPCA every year puts out its lobbying papers and its news releases, the most recent one just today on a call for action. And none of these call for actions or things seem to work. And I'm really interested in your opinion as to what is the problem? Why can't we wake up the citizenry to support their national parks, to prevail upon Congress to do something about this?
Aha! You stated the problem and the potential solution in that one, comment in question. I think it was Einstein that said the problems of today will not be solved by the minds that created them. And so the Park Service, being an agency of about 108, well, exactly 108 years old, has a significant tradition, has a significant percentage of the people who work within the Park Service and even in the leadership that come from a certain demographic, a certain way of thinking, and almost a military style uh, connection to how they see that things should not change and should not necessarily evolve to include the demographic changes that have happened in our country in, let's say, the last 20 years. So
Mhm.
I am suggesting that the rank and file in the Park Service is quite old and has some old-fashioned thinking that does not allow them to capture or even engage and embrace the vibrancy of the new populations of America, the ones that are, setting the stage in culture, in fashion, in music. You know, you might think that that doesn't have anything to do with national parks, but we're talking about the lifeblood of the culture. And if these people who are almost half of the population now, I'm talking about, black and brown people of color, indigenous people, these people who are almost half of the population are not connected to the national parks. And it has been my contention for at least the past well, let's say 20 years since I found out about the national parks, that there needed to be a serious national campaign launched to engage the people who do not know about the national parks, the people who do not have the tradition of their parents taking them in the station wagon to camp in national parks in the summer. Multiple millions of those people are people like myself who, if they happen to stumble upon the national park system in the same way that I did and with my husband Frank, might have a tremendous positive effect in moving the agency forward. But my sense is the leadership and the thinking is calcified. And so until we're able to break through that, including potentially even at NPCA, I know that they have gotten to be more inclusive over the years, but it's nothing like the level of inclusiveness, the level of parity that needs to happen so that people can feel vested in the National Park Service, in the National Park system, and really have a desire to help make the changes, to help lobby Congress, you know, to help get other people involved, to let the whole world know about these treasures that we have that we're charged with protecting for the benefit of ourselves and that of future generations.
Well, I note, for example, on when NPCA, for example, does its lobbying, they emphasize, and quite rightly so, the economic benefit that parks provide to this country. Billions of dollars worth of economic benefit is generated by the National Park Service and the millions of visitors that go. And they try to make the argument that the National Park Service should be funded at the levels necessary to protect the parks and to protect its resources for this and future generations. But is the argument, is an economic argument the argument that we should be making? I mean, aren't there other arguments that we can make that might resonate with people that would motivate them to get more involved with protecting their national parks?
I am so glad you asked that. Let's just take my story, well, because I like to talk about myself. Okay, I'm just kidding. But, when my husband Frank and I stumbled up in the national park system in 1995, I literally thought I had died and gone to heaven. I was like, this is not possible because this does not look anything like the earth that I have been walking upon in my 44 years. Okay. And this happened at Acadia National Park in Maine, where I was completely transformed by the expanse of untouched beauty that I saw. And driving around the entire country and seeing these places one after the other that were so unearthly beautiful. And all of them had the sign behind it, Yellowstone National Park, I was like, what is a national park? And then when I found out, I became really incensed because I had left places in my community where people were suffering from the effects of poisoning at environmental justice communities that had been used as dumps and where people were suffering from various kinds of cancers. And, people, my friend said she had 12 different black dresses because, in a month she might have to go to 12 different funerals. Can you imagine that? And then suddenly here I was in this pristine world and everybody in it was white.
Mm-hmm.
It was amazing. So the fact of the matter is that, you know, we live in literally two different worlds. And the argument um, that I would make is that Americans need to see and know the land treasury with which we are blessed. And I believe that, like me, the majority of people would give everything to help support that, knowing that that is what supports us, cleanses our air, purifies our water, keeps our wildlife going. It's what sustains our environment. So I do think that there's a lot more than the economic argument or even the policy argument that needs to be made. It's the people argument. Parks, people.
Well, even going back many years to the almost to the founding of the National Park Service, particularly, and we talked about this the last time you were on the program, the fact that Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., um, Franklin Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, many people put forward the notion that national parks are for the people. It's about the foundation of this country, its land and its water. Uh, it's important for the health and well-being of people. E.O. Wilson made the point in his book Biophilia, which we discussed the last time you were on the program, that people sprang from the environment, were connected to the land. Everything that we are as human beings has to do with our connection to the land, and that our health depends upon it. And many, for example, health institutions have taken up this notion. For example, I was at my physical therapist the other day, just yesterday, and at this institution, which would not have been the case 15 or 20 years ago, it's beautiful. They bring in the outdoors. All of the photos are of nature. There are waterfalls inside. Everything is calming. There's become this realization that our health and well-being is dependent upon our connection to the natural world. And yet, I seldom, if ever, hear a director, a deputy director, NPCA get before Congress and in their literature make the point that these are the most important fundamental reasons that our parks need to be protected. And so it seems to me that there's needs to be a concerted effort to change, and I think you were saying this, to change the conversation, not just in terms of the demographic visitation, but also in terms of what's fundamental for the human spirit in its relation to our natural environment, and to somehow collectively get the entire country behind this notion. And I know you've been writing blogs, that you've gotten people over the years excited about national parks and the environment in general, particularly people that have been disenfranchised or just may not have known or had the information about national parks and its importance. So I guess my question to you, if you were to be before Congress right now, or not even, or let's say you were on The View on television, what would you tell the American citizen they need to do, and the reasons why they need to protect their national parks? What are there some specific steps that individual human beings can take to make a difference?
Oh, yes, oh, yes, oh, yes. And yes, I would like to be on The View, and I'd like to be before Congress because I could tell them a thing or two. I have had the luxury of going to 185 units of the national park system, from the U.S. Virgin Islands to National Park to Mount Denali in Alaska. And in this conversation, we cannot overlook the fact and acknowledging that the national parks were originally the domain of the indigenous people,
Mhm.
and that they were forcibly removed in many cases from the land to create these places that we now treasure as national parks. And if I want a view, I would say to people, look, there's an entire world. You know that place you're looking for that you call heaven? It's actually here, right here on earth
Oh,
with
that's a good
you.
point.
There are places in America of such supernatural beauty that when you go there, your heart breathes,
Mhm.
"Oh my God,"
I
or
love it.
whatever, however you know describe the divine creative spirit. So to live on earth and yearn for heaven and overlook the beauty that is right here with us, I really find that very ironic. And yet, I do not really laugh at it because I know some of the things that contribute to it being that way. First of all, sometimes when I talk about national parks, I'll tell you this one example. A young man from a group of people from Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles, that we took to Zion, Bryce, and Grand Canyon. One of the young men came to us and he said, when you talk about national parks, we have no idea what you're talking about because park to us is that little, scrubby place down the street that all the druggies hang out. So we don't really want to go there. I had no idea that places like this exist in the world. So the first thing is people don't really know what you're talking about when you talk about national parks. It is very difficult to conceive of it if you've never seen it. I would not have conceived of it before I saw them.
Right.
Right. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is people think it's so expensive, right? They
Mhm.
do not know that you can buy an $80 pass and it takes you and four other people in your car into every national park in the country for a full year.
Mhm.
And moreover, if you're over age 62 or you're a veteran or differently abled, you might be able to get a pass for the rest of your life, or you might be able to go in free for the rest of your life.
Mhm.
So it is not necessarily a costly endeavor. Yes, you do need transportation to get to some of the major national parks. But listen, they're in every state and you can drive to them. So the first thing you need is the information and the invitation because a lot of people now are concerned about where they are in the country because of the noxious behavior of some members of our citizenry. Simultaneously, though, and here's the big part that you know, Don,
Mhm.
the history of America and the development of America and how every ethnic group contributed to the development of our country in its exploration, in its building, in its nurturing, in its defense. Every ethnic group can find the national parks where their ethnic group made contributions that were pivotal to the development and evolution of our country. So I would say all of those things. And I would say Oh, who was it who said this? Oh, yes, the first director of the National Park System said, he or she is a better citizen with a keener appreciation of the benefits of living here who has traveled the national parks.
Yes. No, that's absolutely true. And getting that message out there, I think, is absolutely critical. And I think one of the things I've been involved in over the years is building coalitions. Early in the 90s, prior to the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, we had a tremendous effort and coalition to renew and restore and get permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. The funds of the Land and Water Conservation Fund come from Outer Continental Shelf oil royalties and fund acquisitions of federal lands. And now in the Great Americans Outdoors Act, an update of the Land and Water Conservation Fund also provides funding for national parks, backlog maintenance, and other resources. And building coalitions seems to me to be um, paramount and critical in getting the message to Congress of how important our national parks are. It's interesting that we're having this debate in a political sense about the threats to democracy, but the threats that are evident in our national parks are just as important as the threats to democracy. Because if you don't have land, if you don't have water, if you don't have these extremely important resources that are the foundation of the country that this great country that is America, then because that foundation falls apart, everything begins to crumble. And I can't remember who said it, but he said we have to be very vigilant against the whittling away, and that is the systematic and almost insidious chipping away at these very important resources like our national parks. And it's almost unseen. It's like the frog in the boiling water metaphor. It just happens very slowly. And I am extremely concerned that that's what's happening with our national parks. And even though people may not believe it's possible, it would ever be possible for our national parks to disappear, I would disagree. And I think we really need a very strong call to arms for a concerted effort and coalition amongst all organizations to rally behind our national parks. And I know some of the work that you've done would be instrumental in building that type of coalition. So the final thing I want to ask you, there's been some ideas, and we're going to have a further discussion with John Jarvis, the 18th director of the National Park Service, former director. He'll be on the program soon talking about his solution to the problem. He's written a great book where he puts forward the notion that perhaps the National Park Service ought to be like the Smithsonian, an independent agency, so that it's not a prey to some of the politics that National Park Service happens to be a prey to. Now, I was wondering if you had any comments on that, maybe taking the National Park Service out of the Department of Interior and making it an independent agency. And like I say, we'll have some further discussion on the program about that.
I actually don't know about that. That has not been my forte. I am perfectly happy to work with the park service that is adequately funded. But I don't know about removing it from the Department of Interior. But here's the thing that I want to say, and I hope that former Director Jarvis will address this, or that you'll ask him to. One of the fundamental problems that we're having is that the many people within the Park Service do not see non-white Americans as capable of or as desirable to be included in the enjoyment of the National Park System, in the workforce of the National Park Service, and just generally do not see. People actually told us, Frank and me, that you people have so many survival issues. You can't really afford to be involved with environment or national parks. And I will tell you this: a 2016 report actually said that in the Park Service, people saw diversity or diverse and competent as mutually exclusive. Now think about that. Diverse and competent are mutually exclusive. And this was 2016, less than 10 years ago. And this is a concept that we have come up against ever since we, as I said, stumbled upon the National Park System in 1995 and chose to decide to do something about it, right? So until we unearth that nefarious thinking, that thinking that will it will undermine everything. We cannot really make progress until we unearth the part of the iceberg that's below the surface that keeps tripping us up. We have to address that. And here's the thing: when you talk about the potential dissolution of the national parks, and therefore the dissolution of our democracy, there's another big side to that, and that is the stories. Hardly anybody knows that the Black man Benjamin Banneker, okay, was instrumental in laying out the capital city of DC. Who knows that? hardly anybody, right?
Mhm.
Who knows that there were Black men and Hispanic men, that there were Black women and white women, that all of the races and ethnic groups were at Valley Forge in that terrible, terrible winter of 1776, that encampment with General Washington, where they did not have a supply line established. And so they had to forage for food, right? And for clothing. And yet that's where the United States Army wound up being organized. But when I learned that my ancestors, my Black ancestors were there, I said, this country belongs to me as much as to anyone else. I will strive to bring forth the democracy that our forefathers envisioned, right? That we have the opportunity of taking forward now. When I learned about the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse Village, and it's a national park where you can go and see where the Confederate General Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant. Come on, and Ulysses S. Grant had to give him sustenance, had to give him food for his starving men, and give him horses. And Lee reportedly told his men to go back home and conduct themselves as Americans. So all of these vital stories and so many more. The Buffalo Soldiers saving the giant sequoias that are more than 2,000 years old, that were here when Jesus walked on earth. And they would not be here because, people wanted to cut them down as so many board feet of lumber. The
Right.
Buffalo Soldiers only recently released out of enslavement up there in Yosemite and Sequoia saving these places. Come on. There's so much lack of information in the public domain. And I tell you, all of these conspiracy theories will fall and really be dashed against the rock of truth in the national parks. So, but the national parks, where are they? They're out there. If you know about them, you can go out there and experience them. But they should be in the public domain telling these stories so that everybody knows.
Well, Audrey, I think what I hear you saying, and I think the most important message that you're saying, and I don't want our listeners to misunderstand, is that when these stories about enslaved Africans, women, Native Americans, brown people, and then all people collectively are told, and told in the context of our national parks, where people can go and learn about these stories, what it cultivates is an appreciation for all of us collectively as human beings. And then the message becomes, yes, we're different, and as important as those differences may be, our common humanity is what matters the most. Why? Because it binds us all together and strengthens us. Because we don't need to be a divided country and a divided people. And when we understand each other's stories and how we collectively have contributed to this great nation, it makes the nation that much stronger. And that's why it's important that these stories be told. And that's why it's important that our National Park Service and all of its units, whether historical, cultural, or natural, be protected for this and future generations. Audrey, I want to thank you for joining us on the program, and we're going to continue to work together on this. We have a whole series. We're going to have probably half a dozen episodes on this, and out of this, I am hoping that we do build this broad coalition that will begin to wake up the entire nation, which is necessary to prevail upon its leaders to continuing to protect our national parks and provide the funding and resources that they need. Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you so much, Don. I appreciate you.
And I appreciate you too. We'll have you back again. Let's continue working on this.
I look forward.
Okay. Take care, Audrey. We'll talk again soon.
Bye-bye.
I want to thank you all for joining us on this episode of Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. In future episodes, we'll be continuing our discussion on the National Park Service funding. For now, stay safe, share happiness, And remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.